Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Richard Abel. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Lebanon Democrats. Tonight, we have a special guest who has been traveling around the world, racing back to be with us tonight. Thomas Oppel. Tom, are you a native of New Hampshire?
I am not.
You're not, but
Unfortunately, I got here as soon as I could, but I was born in New Jersey.
he was born in New Jersey. Okay.
Don't hold that against me. No, nowhere near either the Turnpike or the Park. Oh,
Yeah, so look, well, I was born in Pennsylvania, and it took me longer to get here than I think it took Tom, perhaps. When I was preparing a brief introduction, I realized that we both lived in the state of Mississippi, in Jackson, Mississippi, at the same time. We overlapped one another. So you never know where you'll run into people again. Tom is going to speak tonight about the Biden administration and some of its accomplishments, its challenges. We'll have a chance for questions and answers. We'll have a chance for some conversation afterward. And Tom has had a remarkable career. He worked for the governor of the state of Mississippi, Ray Mabus, and previous to that was a newspaper reporter in Jackson for the Clarion Ledger. And then when Governor Mabus became the Secretary of the Navy, Tom went with him and was really I think it's his top assistant there, and has also had quite a career in politics in terms of helping people get elected and being an advisor and so forth. I'll cut that part short, Frank. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Thomas Oppel. You are now living in Canaan. Okay, so he's, yes. Good. Thank you.
thank you. I feel like I'm speaking to the choir, but be that as it may, I was asked tonight to speak about the Biden administration and the Biden-Harris administration, I should say appropriately, and their record of accomplishments. And I know, as usual, and I feel every right to say this since I used to be a journalist, something that former Governor and Secretary Mabus still holds against me, I think. The media likes to simplify issues, and they like to create these binary choices. Good economy or healthy environment, pick one. I don't think that's going to work out so well if we can't breathe. If we got 6 feet of water, as unfortunately our neighbors in Vermont and some places in New Hampshire are finding out, all of these things are connected. And so there are, the easy choices that we get presented on the cable news are not so easy. And I know it's become sort of fashionable these days. And I will be the first to admit, Joe Biden was not my first choice in the primary in 2020. I know he wasn't the first choice of a lot of people in Hampshire. I think he finished 5th, which is why he probably has a chip on his shoulder about our first in the nation primary, but be that as it may. I hope he puts his name on the ballot here in New Hampshire. I really do. And I really do believe that for all of the negative stuff that you hear about Joe Biden and his age and whatever, the fact is, when you really look at the record, it is an amazing record. And I think it is absolutely comparable in many ways to either FDR or another choice that at the time I wasn't particularly thrilled with, Lyndon Johnson. And, it's interesting that I guess in many ways, FDR, Johnson, Biden all faced different sorts of challenges to get where they are or to get through where they are. And if you go back and look, and I did this, I did it recently, but the first time I did it was when my boss, the secretary, wanted to name a ship after Lyndon Johnson. The Secretary of the Navy has the great privilege of naming all of our ships, all of Navy ships. And he wanted to name a ship after Lyndon Johnson. And one of the things that I did was I went back and looked at the record. And obviously, I was eligible for the draft and was one of those didn't have student deferments. They had ended. And so that tainted a lot of our views of LBJ. But when you think about it, Medicare, Medicaid, Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Civil Rights Act of 1968, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, LBJ. And probably one of my heroes, John Kennedy, probably could not have gotten that done the way LBJ did. And I worked in the Obama administration, have great respect for President Obama. But when you look at what Joe Biden has done in the last 3 years, there's an amazing, amazing track record. And it's one that I don't think any of us talk about enough. And, I wanted to say tonight, President Biden has I think is a wonderful phrase where he tells people, don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternative. So I want to start tonight by just sort of reminding all of us of the things that have happened in the last 3 years, even with a 50-50 Senate and for the first 2 years, a bare majority in the House, which Speaker Pelosi navigated magnificently. And currently we have the clown show, in the House under, I can't even call him Speaker, Mr. McCarthy. So just a quick trip down memory lane. We're all still dealing with post-COVID world. And sometimes it's hard to remember what pre-COVID was like. But if you think back to when Joe Biden took office, unemployment was very, very high. People were basically not going out. Businesses were closing. We had the horrendous events of January 6th, and we're only now realizing it wasn't just a one-day event. It was actually a plot to overthrow the government, and it's an ongoing plot. They haven't stopped. But in that environment, the president passed the American Recovery Act, $1.9 trillion. And for all the talk about the debt and spending, this is a Congress that under President Trump cut taxes on the wealthiest Americans, leaving the middle class and working class Americans to pick up the tab. That, and I believe I'm correct in saying the debt, US debt, doubled under Trump. It was the highest creation of debt in any single presidential administration. And I believe the cumulative debt created by Trump and his tax cut was more than the debt by all previous presidents going back to George Washington. So when Republicans talk about, oh my God, the deficit and spending and what, Really? Almost as hypocritical as this next element, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Another $1 trillion in spending that we're only now really beginning to see its impact in terms of broadband, in terms of roads and bridges. That Infrastructure Investment Act was part of the money that enabled Governor Shapiro in Pennsylvania to do that miraculous job of putting that piece of Interstate 95 through Philly back together in a few weeks. I mean, it was an amazing job. Oh, by the way, there was $1 billion to New Hampshire. $1 billion. And I know Senator Prentice, for the Infrastructure Act alone, New Hampshire, there was $1 billion that came to New Hampshire. Now, how good was that bill? It was so good that the 30 Republican senators who voted against it and the 200 Republican members of the House who voted against it, and we got it passed anyway, are now in many cases trying to take credit for the bridges and the broadband and all of the other things that they voted against. Well, I voted against that. I'm for, fiscal responsibility. And this bridge here, yeah, I did that. Another example of their hypocrisy. So what did we get for the American Recovery Act and the investment and the infrastructure? Which, oh, by the way, we all remember Infrastructure Week in the Trump administration. Still waiting, but President Biden made it happen. And what we have is Infrastructure Week after week after week after week of actually rebuilding this country, creating jobs, creating really good construction jobs, creating really good union jobs, as well as making it easier to get to market for businesses, for people going to school. So personal income in the US now is above 5%. The increase in personal income has grown by over 5%. And in many cases, and I don't have specifics, but in many cases, the personal income growth is highest in states that voted against President Biden. And unlike his predecessor, President Biden keeps saying, I want to be president for every American, whether you voted for me or not, as opposed to the former guy who only wants to be president for people who think like him, and I hate to say look like him, but key elements of both the Recovery Act and the Infrastructure Investment Act was a focus on climate change that is unprecedented, that we've never seen before. This is a president who I think smartly says, when I think climate change, I think jobs. And understanding that, that dealing with climate change, mitigating climate change, doing the things we need to do to make ourselves more resilient, which is part of the Infrastructure Investment Act, and to deal with what's coming. God knows we're going to have more summers like this one, where it's hot and it's humid. I just came back from Mississippi, and the difference between the temperature in Jackson and the temperature here, it's not that much. And the only difference is they're going to have 100-degree days, on into October. And that's coming here. So our world is going to change. But this president recognized that we have to do something about climate. And just as importantly, he recognized that dealing with climate change can be an economic engine for this country. It doesn't have to be a drag the way the Republicans are talking about it. In the same way that going from horse and buggy to automobile was an economic engine. In the same way that building railroads and then building an interstate highway system and then building, creating a transportation hub through the air, the airlines, all of those things have been economic drivers. Now, there have been consequences to them. But the fact of the matter is, as we're thinking about climate change going forward, this president has been very, very focused on making sure that we're dealing with climate change in a responsible way, but in a way that is also helping boost our economy. And frankly, just as importantly, in a way that is that reflects a perspective of justice. That too often in this country, as we saw in Boston, as we've seen in other neighborhoods, interstate highways divided communities, and the folks on the wrong side of the tracks, so to speak, weren't thought of at all. And this administration is taking that into account and beginning to understand that in many cases, minority communities, African-American communities, communities of color were dispossessed or frankly damaged by development. And this administration is taking steps to try and change that. The fact that he keeps going to bat on student debt, and I hear people complain about, well, he's not keeping his promises. Well, he's trying. And at some point, particularly those of you who hold elective office, understand, you can't always just snap your fingers and make things happen as much as we might want them to. You got to deal with the fact that there are 14 Republicans in the New Hampshire Senate and 1 or 2 more Republicans in the House, and hopefully we can change that soon. But the fact is he's trying. Supreme Court dealt a blow, I think, and I think the president feels they were wrong, but he's come back. It's not nearly the plan that he had hoped, but it's a start. And I hope people recognize that for what it is. I think his effort on civil rights has been similarly impressive. If you have not had a chance, I urge you to read the dissent by Justice Brown. I always get this wrong. Ketanji Brown Jackson, Justice Jackson, forgive me. Justice Jackson, her dissent in the case regarding affirmative action. It is a brilliant tour de force recitation of the history of discrimination in this country by someone who has seen it firsthand. And it is to marvel at. And if any of the justices on the other side of that decision had a sense of shame, which at least several of them apparently don't, they would be or should be ashamed reading that, because it's just brilliant and well done. And then, and I have maybe a better understanding of this, having spent 8 years at Navy as the Secretary's Chief of Staff. My boss traveled probably 1.5 million miles, went to 150 countries. We have a global Navy. We need to have a global Navy, frankly. We are the world's first responders. The Navy and the Marine Corps are the folks who, when there is a disaster, humanitarian assistance is necessary, disaster relief, it's the Navy and Marine Corps, the US Navy and Marine Corps, that very often are the ones who get there first with assistance, with help, with medical supplies. I had a chance to see firsthand after the tsunami and the nuclear plant, the Fukushima nuclear plant meltdown. The people the government of Japan were asking for were US Navy nuclear officers who were on the scene. We had an aircraft carrier. I think it was the Abraham Lincoln, but we had an aircraft carrier that was headed at the time to Afghanistan, and changed course almost immediately, went to Japan. And I had the privilege, we were in the CIC, the Command Information Center, and there were admirals and captains and all sorts of military people in this room. But the briefing was being given by a third-class petty officer, a second-class petty officer, and an ensign. Because the Navy pushes responsibility down, and young kids are making critical decisions. And this third-class petty officer, I'll never forget this, he was explaining how they were using the same targeting techniques that they would have used against adversaries to identify areas where people needed help, where they needed supplies, where they needed to be evacuated for medical reasons or other reasons. And they were using the same techniques. And at one point, as he's giving this briefing, and it was clear he had worked on this a long time and memorized his words, at one point he stopped and he looked down and he looked up and he looked directly at the secretary and said, "Brain freeze, sir," and got right back into it. That was apparently what he needed. But this president, for all the talk about in the last administration about world opinion about the US, I got to see world opinion firsthand. And the United States is the indispensable player in the world for a whole variety of reasons. I saw it when we went to Estonia, and they had just suffered a cyber attack from Russians because they had the temerity to move a statue of Stalin from a town square to a Russian cemetery sort of out of the main traffic area. And the Russians responded by shutting down their banking system for 2 days. They also were dealing with the fact that their entire electrical grid only went one way east back into the former Soviet Union. And they were desperately trying to rebuild it to connect with Finland and Scandinavia. And they were looking to us for help. And they were looking to us, this is before they joined NATO, they were looking to us for protection. And I saw the same thing in Latvia and Lithuania. I saw the same thing in Poland, in the Czech Republic, in all of these places. And in the former administration, NATO, which is one of the great alliances in human history, was being systematically destroyed by the former guy. And if he gets back into office, he will destroy it. And if he gets back into office, the people of Ukraine will be abandoned. He claims he'll solve the problem in 24 hours. The way he'll solve the problem is to give Putin everything he wants. We've seen that before. 4 years, almost to the day, from President Biden's recent address about how we're going to stand by Ukraine, was the fourth anniversary of the spectacle of a US president standing next to Vladimir Putin and essentially saying, well, I don't believe our people, I believe Vladdy here. Disgusting, just absolutely disgusting. So that's the record. And I had an opportunity a couple of weeks ago. I was in DC. Friend of mine, a woman I had worked with, she was my deputy at Navy. She's now an assistant secretary of Navy. And the Marines did a sunset parade. It's really a wonderful, one of the great things about Navy is all of the traditions they have. But at that event, I got to sit next to the Ukrainian ambassador to the US. And we had a brief conversation, but it was very, very clear. They are counting on us to keep their country. They are depending on us, and they are fearful of what may happen next. And I guess that's where I want to sort of close is for us to understand, and all of you, whether you're watching or you're here in person, obviously are committed to the Democratic Party and to our values and to our country. And we all have to understand what the choice really is in 2024. And it doesn't matter, as it appears Trump will be the nominee, but it really doesn't matter whether he is the nominee or not. Unfortunately, we only have one party at this point that is committed to maintaining our democracy, to maintaining the US standing in the world, and to maintaining us as this experiment in government of and for and by the people, started in 1776 and maintained through the blood sacrifice of the Civil War in 1861 to 1865, when linguistically we went from being the United States are to the United States is. First time that happened was in 1865, when we finally recognized we are one country, not just a collection of independent states, despite what the Republicans will have you think. And, you know, the way I describe it is we have one party that keeps shouting about freedom. They're for freedom. But the truth of it is, they're only for freedom if you look like them and think like them. So if you're an African American, if you're Hispanic, if you're Asian, if you're a woman, if you're gay or lesbian or queer or transgender, anything other than a straight white male who thinks the rest of the world owes them privilege, then there's no freedom for you. They don't believe in freedom for you. We've seen it in Supreme Court decisions. We've seen it in a series of over 70 different legislative actions across the country to suppress or prevent the vote of people who won't vote for them. They just want to rig the game. That's what's at stake. And I hear my own members of my own family sometimes bemoaning, well, you know, Biden's old. And, you know, my first question would be, okay, so if he were 10 years younger, would that make a huge difference? And, you know, whatever age he is, he looks pretty spry and smart. And, you know, he went overseas on a trip. And I know any of us who've traveled overseas, I couldn't have done that schedule. I couldn't have done what President Biden just did. It's exhausting. And I did, when I was at Navy, I did about 100 or 750,000 miles in about 75 different countries, without counting 6 or 7 trips to Afghanistan and 4 or 5 trips to Japan and 4 or 5 trips to Europe. That kind of travel is exhausting. And he went over there and knocked it out of the park, as far as I'm concerned. That was the most impressive. If you weren't proud of the president before, you should be today. And I'll just say, I'll end with three quick things. One, the phrase that I always sort of go back to, and I tell my kids this all the time. The most wonderful part to me of the US Constitution is the preamble that says, in order to form a more perfect union, not a perfect one, a more perfect one. Recognizing that we're human beings, perfection is out of our reach. We should try, but we recognize that it's out of our reach. And then, given that record, I'll go back to the world famous political philosophers, the Rolling Stones. You can't always get what you want, but if you try sometimes, you get what you need. Last thing, if I could just make one political announcement. August 22nd, special election to fill a vacancy in Grafton 16, it's just the town of Enfield. Josh Adjutant resigned from the seat. There's a vacancy. It is one of 3 special elections. If we take all 3, I think we're tied. I think it's 199 to 199 at that point. So Enfield is a pretty blue district, but the thing that scares me to death, I looked at the result from Ward 4 in Nashua in May. They had a special election and we won it. Our nominee, Mark Plumunden, I think. Yeah, it's definitely Plumunden. I think it's Mark. Anyway, if you look at the percentages, he won overwhelming, and it's an overwhelmingly Democratic precinct. But there were only 210 votes cast total. 210. So if the Republicans woke up and did a little organizing, got off their couches, it's not that hard, because, look, it's August 22nd. It's the middle of summer. People got other things going on. It's hard to remember that there's a special election. So we need to get out there and knock on every door in Enfield that we can and really work hard. We have a great nominee, David Frack, who's chairman of the Enfield Planning Board. We had a great event for him 2 weeks ago now, I think 2 weeks ago. This coming Saturday, the 22nd, at Barb Jones's house, Johnston Drive off Route 4, right there at the Enfield Lebanon town line. We're going to do a canvassing kickoff, 10 a.m. If you can come, please do so. If you can't come, if you haven't seen the email to sign up to volunteer to go canvassing, let me know. And Ann and I.
There's a form on the table.
Oh, look at that. My chairman,
Form.
my chairman, and your Lebanon neighbor. So please, let's make sure that we get a big turnout and we crush this seat and capture it. And that'll be 1/3 of the way toward a tie in the House. Sue, I think you're the longest serving who's here tonight.
Here tonight.
Do you have any idea if we get a tie, can we rerun the speaker's race or what happens?
I don't know. So the Senate, I'd forgotten about this, but this is a story
Please.
from the past. But somebody may remember when, but it was about 15, 20 years ago when the Speaker of the President of the Senate died in office, June. Yeah. He had been president, he was a Democrat, and he'd been president for 3 years. And Keene is a very Democratic place. And the Democrats completely and utterly destroyed that on get out the vote effort. I went down with the candidate for Democratic congressperson at the time to help out the Friday before the election. And we went door to door to empty houses because there was a major campaign rally, I think it was by Gore, in Keene, someplace else, and he had been told not to go near it because the Republicans might not vote for him if he went to the campaign rally. And we sat down after we found nobody home, and we asked the 2 interns that had been sent from out of state to help him and him, okay, what's the plan for next Tuesday? And they looked at us. Plan? And we said, yeah, they get out the vote plan. Get out the vote plan? What's that? We lost that election. In Keene, we lost to a Republican. And the Senate turned Republican and hasn't, the only time it's been out of that, I think, since is 1920. which of course we lost most of to the pandemic.
2020, not 1920.
Yeah, sorry.
No, that's okay. I do it all the
I'm
time.
doing a lot of going back to the beginning of the 20th
Back in
century.
1903. I mean,
these days. So it's desperately important that we get out enough people in each of these elections to be able to find out what's going to happen this time. But they did at that point. They got an extra Republican in and they changed the presidency, but the president had died. So I don't know if it's the same thing. And anyway, you allow sick people to vote remotely. The House refuses to allow sick people to do anything unless they show up. So we have very different roles. But
thanks, Sue. So anyway, so whatever happens, we've got a chance to at least have a power sharing agreement, I would assume, with the Republicans in the House. That's step one. And then step two is taking over the Senate. And Sue, are you announcing for Senate President yet, or?
wouldn't do any good. 14.
No, I know.
So it's still many hours, there's a seat or two flags that. you can well turn in.
Well, we're not, I mean, as Ann will attest, we've got later this month, we're gonna, or no, next month, August, we're doing an organizing, putting together an organizing plan with the COAS folks on Senate District 1. I've already met with, that's one of the, absolutely. And I've already met with, and this is tough as well, but I've already met with some folks in Merrimack County about Innis's seat, Senate 7. And one of the things we're going to do is some or many of you may have listened in or to the Zoom meeting with Steve Marchand, who does incredible analytics. He's going to do a presentation at that Senate District 1 meeting in early August. And I'm also going to get him to do something for Senate District 7. So. Oh, right. Yeah, we're working on House District 5. We're going to make sure Corinne, just crushes it in Grafton 9 so that we just put that one away. And we're looking and may have a candidate for Grafton 18. So anyway, so I don't know whether you want to do questions.
Well, yeah, I'm just gonna step back and see if we see, pardon me? Yes, if we'll see if anyone has questions there. I don't see any at the moment. So why don't we start with some questions here, and we may even turn this into a little more of a discussion as we have time. Questions for Tom or observations,
Critiques.
Well, I'll ask a question. Oh, yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy.
Kathy.
And just took the rest of them to have
At the Haverhill County Fair. End of July 26th through
31st,
something like that. Haverhill County Fair, and anybody's not got enough volunteer work. We can use some folks to volunteer to man our table.
the fair is an old-fashioned traditional county fair, and it's really great.
And fun, a lot of fun.
4-H makes good food.
And I can also recommend, I know Chappie's from Canaan is going to have their food truck there too. So good burgers, good fries.
Yes, Jason.
One question I have about the Biden administration, if you go back to the year after the inauguration, one of the big things Democrats kept hitting in the media, in the administration, more in Congress than the administration, was election reform. We were seeing state legislatures across the country passing various degrees of terrifying bills about allowing them to rewrite the results of elections, to limit, to suppress voters to just horrendous degrees, in different cases. And there was also the various tendrils of the, what do they call it, the state election theory that the Supreme Court. Independent.
Independent
Legislature.
And that was still working its way through the courts, and the Biden administration really seems to have, I think, kind of put that on the back burner in a way that didn't really line up with the rhetoric, because they were really focused on infrastructure, really focused on jobs, they were really focused on COVID relief and the energy, and those are all great things, but that's the one big area, seems to me like they maybe dropped the ball. So why do you think that didn't get done at the federal level? And why do you think the administration didn't really make it a priority? Or in your view, did they? And they just couldn't make it.
I'd like to see if we can repeat the question. So that people that are watching either the recording or watching it on Zoom can do that. And that's a tough one. I guess you're saying that the Biden's early in Biden's presidency, he was focusing on other very laudable things, but would it have been better if he would have worked on some of the things that were happening at the state levels that were?
Why did electoral reform not make it?
Why wasn't electoral reform one of those issues? Okay.
That should make the mic omnidirectional now.
Okay. Omnidirectional.
So hopefully everybody online can hear all the
All right,
questions too.
so go ahead.
I will just say, I was actually in my previous, I was consulting with the American Sustainable Business Network, and one of the issues that I worked a lot on was the John Lewis bill, the Freedom to Vote Act. And we had several meetings with the White House trying to encourage them to be more active. And I think, in the end, it was going to be about numbers. We did not have the votes in the Senate to get past a filibuster. And, I think the White House made the calculations. We've got to get the recovery bill through because the country's hurting economically. And they wanted to get the infrastructure bill. They were trying to do some things concurrently. I don't think they dropped the ball. I think they tactically recognized that the numbers weren't there and had conversations with Democratic congressional leaders and Senate leaders, trying to see if there was a workaround Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema to begin with, and then trying to get past, trying to have 10 Republicans who would actually vote for it. And that was just not going to happen. And, look, I'll say this, and I've said this in other circumstances. In 1990, I worked with NARAL, going around the country setting up independent expenditure campaigns to support pro-choice candidates, to oppose anti-choice candidates, and spent a lot of time in focus groups and a lot of other things. And in 1990, and I know this is true, has been true since 1990, the Webster decision had come down, and there was people really thought maybe there is a threat to reproductive rights. And in focus group after focus group after focus group, particularly for women under 45, we simply could not convince them that they could see a world without Roe. They just didn't. Oh, that's never going to happen. They're never going to overturn that. It's the law of the land. It's precedents. Well, it took another 30 years, but the Republicans were very focused on changing the Supreme Court. And they've, and now they're sort of using that Supreme Court to undermine a whole lot of other things. I think my argument is, and I know sometimes people don't like to hear this, but the answer is vote, is participate. Democracy is not a spectator sport. And if you don't like what's going on in Washington or in Concord, we have the power to change it. Now, there are barriers, and we've got to do our best to overcome those barriers. And it's tough to out-organize over voter suppression efforts and similar things. But, look, the fact of the matter is, in many ways, between the filibuster and the Electoral College, some other things, this is not a perfect democracy. And there are all sorts of barriers to having the voice of regular people, citizens united. It's not one person, one vote anymore. It's $1, one vote. If I got more dollars than you, my voice is louder. But you're being here tonight. You're going out and organizing, knocking on doors. All of that is critically important to prevent bad things and to get good things happening, whether it's city council, Concord, or Washington. We like to be proud of our tradition of direct democracy here in New Hampshire, with town meeting, like in my town. But you gotta participate. And participation is not just going to pull the lever. It's supporting candidates. It's knocking on doors. It's writing checks. It's doing all of those things that are critically important.
I have another question, if I might.
Yeah, why don't you come up and then, yeah, you can be close to them. Thank you.
Thank you for all this. It's wonderful. I hope folks can hear me okay in spite of my respirator. I think lots of people that are most marginalized in our country right now feel generally like they're not a priority for either party. Whether you're trans, adult, or child, Black or Indigenous, disabled, a lot of people just think, well, the people with power and money are who are the priority, right? And so I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on what the Biden administration is doing to support civil rights when they're under such intense attack at the state level.
So I think starting with, I don't know how anybody else felt, but watching Ketanji Brown Jackson getting sworn in, I got teary-eyed. First Black woman justice in our country, 250 years later. Think about what the marginalized people must have, if they had an opportunity to come back from 1776 or 1787 and see that, or see Barack Obama being sworn in. It's not enough, but it's at least a start. I absolutely believe Joe Biden and certainly Kamala Harris are committed to, equity, diversity, justice, inclusion. There's no doubt in my mind that they are taking steps to try and do that. As I said, with the way the infrastructure bill was structured, with the way the Recovery Act was structured, where specifically provisions and dollars were set aside for marginalized communities, be they African-American, tribal communities, indigenous communities. So I think absolutely, when you look at the kind of justices or judges rather, that President Biden, who is doing, and give Chuck Schumer some credit too, he is trying to move these judges through, despite the fact that, we now have Coach Tuberville, who may be smarter than a football, but not by much, holding up military appointments, and others trying to hold up judicial appointments simply to sort of, much like Mitch McConnell did to Merrick Garland, and essentially stole a Supreme Court seat with this rationale of, oh, it's an election year. We were 11 months from the election, but it's an election year. We can't, put a justice in an election year. Oh, but Amy Coney Barrett, just a few months, weeks before the election, that's a different thing. Because somehow it had something to do with who has a majority in the Senate. So it's just pure politics. It has nothing to do with anything. And Mitch making up the rules as he went along. So I absolutely believe this administration is committed to and has demonstrated its commitment through its appointments, through the provisions in the major pieces of legislation that are passed. But again, you can only do so much when you don't have 60 votes in the Senate, or you don't have enough to eliminate the filibuster. And when you have, I already described what I thought the current US House leadership was like. I mean, they're inventing whistleblowers, who are being indicted for working with the Chinese government. And well, we want to hear from them because, maybe they have something to tell us. It's just crazy.
I think one of the ways the Biden administration is helps on the margin. No. I don't hear you on that. That's true.
Yeah. We need
Just a quick opinion. Hello, good to see everybody. I think one of the ways that the Biden administration has worked to support marginalized communities is actually in trying to do student debt relief. Like, we know what happened with the first round of it. And so now there's a new package. We know that many of those programs are predatory, that they, those that took advantage of them didn't have anything else really to take advantage of. And it was the only way that they could get their education. So it's one of the ways that I look at not just a promise that was made and a promise kept, but I believe that this is a really targeted action to try to help marginalized communities, my opinion.
And,
No shoes on.
and I'll just say, don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternative. So here's the alternative. Joe Biden trying to eliminate student debt. Donald Trump was trying to create student debt with Trump University, bogus, I want to show you how to really screw people, I guess.
I was just gonna say, this brochure says that 66% of his nominees for judicial positions are women and 65% are people of color. So that's something.
I think that's huge. I mean,
Respect for
So-
marriage.
So I would also focus on, because this is the one I know, the Department of Energy, is that environmental justice and equity is a screen that goes across everything. And I would imagine that it really includes all of those secretaries.
I think there's no question about that. And, and look, I know this firsthand. When I started at Navy in 2009, energy management in the Navy was how far you pushed your pedal to the metal. And by the time we left, my boss made reducing fossil fuel, dependence on fossil fuel, a key priority. And we were able, by 2017, when we left, 5 minutes before Trump was sworn in, we had reduced ashore, we had gotten to 2/3 renewables through hydro, through solar, through wave action, depending on some places ashore, and afloat, we had gotten to about 40%. Now, I know some people don't like this. We were using nuclear because all of our carriers and all of our submarines are nuclear powered. But we have not, the Navy has never had a nuclear accident. They have an exceptional record. Since then, every single service chief throughout the Trump administration, every time they went before Congress to testify, identified climate change as a key issue that could disrupt global stability. So they all got the message, and they continued to deliver that message even in the face of having the Trump administration criticize them for. And try to get them to change their testimony. And I know that firsthand. I talked to admirals and generals who, got a little bit of a dressing down from people who shouldn't be, can barely dress up, let alone be dressing down an admiral or a general. But anyway. Can I just say, let me just say one last thing. Here's the message. We have a president who has accomplished more in 3 short years than any president since Lyndon Johnson, in my opinion. And whether you love him or not, whether you're concerned about his age or not, this election will be about whether we're going to maintain our democracy, first of all. And then second of all of the other issues that we all care about, whether it's justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, or climate, or the economy, any of those, all of those issues, all depend on our ability to maintain our democracy and our ability to vote and to participate and to speak out. And it's dependent on all of us in this room, everybody who's still watching, and all of the tens and dozens and hundreds of people that we can touch in the next 18 months. So thank you all for being here tonight, and thank you for your service.